Happy Tuesday. Welcome to another episode of While You're Working Live. I'm so excited for you guys to be here with us. It is our official 30th episode of this show. Thank you to our diehards out there. I'm thinking Ellen Loomstein is probably our number one fan, and we hope she's tuning in today. And we appreciate everybody's support as we have gone through these episodes. We have a really great one for you today. I'm interviewing a uber expert in the podcasting field, and he is going to help us understand a little bit more about how to integrate a podcast into your marketing strategy. So if you've tossed around the idea of a podcast, which I'm sure most of the viewers out there have done so at least once in one of your brainstorm sessions in the last couple of years, it's been a pretty hot topic, especially for us around here. You've probably wondered, how do we do this? How do we get the content for it? How do we add it to our strategy? Is it the right use of our resources? Where do we even begin? If those questions have ever run across your mind, then this is going to be a really great episode for you to pay attention to. Today, Jerod and I are going to discuss a lot of those particular questions. And then we're also going to hear a few stories from him about what he has done with some of his own clients and how they have executed a really successful podcast into their marketing strategy. So I keep saying into their marketing strategy, and we are going to cover that particular point here a little bit later, and it is a really important one. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our special guest, Jerod Morris. Jerod, how are you today?
I'm doing wonderful, Ashley. Thank you for having me on.
Of course. I'm so excited to have you. Another fellow diehard basketball fan. I hear you're a super big fan of Indiana basketball.
That's right.
I can totally relate to that.
Yeah, you mentioned all this talk about podcasting. I thought we were just going to debate which program has the better history between KU and Indiana.
Well, I don't know how much of a debate that would be, but we could certainly get into that topic if you'd like to. Maybe a little later in the episode.
The recent history gives you the big time edge, so we'll just leave that one for now.
It does. I can play nice though. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have you. Jerod is he likes to call himself the podcast mentor. He has published over 1,000 episodes of different podcasts ranging on various topics, including Indiana basketball. And so we are excited to have his input and thought leadership on today's show. So we will jump right into it. Jerod, I wanted to start off with just talking to you a little bit about something you said in one of our pre-show brainstorm meetings I thought was super powerful. And it was just a phrase that you uttered, and it was just like there's nothing to it, but it really caught my attention. You said the power of there's something in the power of a podcast. Can you explain a little bit more about what you meant by that?
Yes. I think the greatest power of a podcast is the power to connect. Like that's, if you're going to launch a podcast, if that is one of your goals, that should be the reason why you do it, is to connect on a deeper level with an audience, because that's what podcasting really allows you to do. And the reason why that is the case is because of the power of audio and the power of having your voice inside of someone's ears, inside of someone's head. It's a very intimate thing. And especially when you consider the kinds of places that a lot of people listen to podcasts, when they're driving to work, when they're taking a shower, when they're getting dressed. I had a guy actually that I talked to last week. He listens to my show about IU basketball. Mm-hmm. And, he's telling me he's been a long time listener. I was talking to him about a podcast he wants to start. And he's like, now, I don't want this to sound weird, but I listen to you guys when I'm falling asleep. I'm like, okay. He's like, no, don't take that the wrong way. Don't take that the wrong way. Yeah, it's not that you put me to sleep. It's just that I've been listening to you for a while and it's so familiar. There's something comforting about listening to your voices. So I fall asleep and then I get up in the morning and I listen to whatever I missed. And it was like, but that's what we wanted to create with that show, is that familiarity, that connection. And so I think when you do podcasting right, that's what you create. And so I think if there is a particular audience, a particular group of people that you want to go deeper with, mm-hmm. that you want to really get to know you on a more intimate level, and obviously learn about your content and learn about what you do, but also just get to know you, then a podcast is such a great way to do it. Just because of the medium itself, because of the power of audio. and because of the unique way that people consume podcasts, which is different than how they consume any other content, because it only requires ear attention. It doesn't require the attention of the eyes. So I think when you add those things up, it creates this really unique power that makes podcasting really special.
I agree. I actually was driving back to Kansas, where my parents live, this past weekend, and it's about a 7-hour drive both ways. I listened to podcasts probably 5 hours of the 7-hour drive, and it's amazing how deeply and like internally you digest the content when you're listening to a podcast. One of my favorites is The Revisionist History by Malcolm Gladwell.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with that one, but
it's one of the best.
I love everything that he talks about, and it makes me think, and I remember and I retain like almost everything that he talks about, which is not so much to be said about blog posts sometimes or any other forms of content. So I think when you say that there's power in a podcast, I really believe it. And especially because the audiences that are listening, I don't want to say captive in a bad way, but I mean, they are more of a captive audience, and their attention is held probably a little bit greater than almost any other platform, I would say.
There certainly is the power for that. Now, I think you obviously have good examples of podcasts and bad. So the one that you mentioned, Malcolm Gladwell, Revisionist History, I'm the same way. I mean, that is one of the most well-produced podcasts that there is, in part, because they've got a big budget to produce it well, and in part because Malcolm Gladwell is a genius when it comes to storytelling. And so he's so great at hooking you and keeping you in there. And, few other people are going to be like Malcolm Gladwell, and you don't have to be like that to be able to create that kind of connection. But that's the other thing is if you can tell stories, if you can, put your content, somehow into a story, man, I mean, the power just amplifies itself even more. So that's a really great example that you give of Revisionist History. And for anybody who wants to kind of, okay, what should a podcast sound like? Listen to that one, because it's really, really well done.
It's amazing. I actually was listening to one of his episodes and it made me cry. It was so powerful. So it's phenomenal. So you bring up a really good point though. And I think it's important to kind of talk about this a little bit with, when a brand or a company, whether big or small, is considering a podcast, I think that, if somebody is familiar with podcasts, they might immediately go to some of these bigger ones that they've found on like the top charts list or something like the Revisionist History, which is phenomenally produced. He's a great storyteller. There's multiple aspects that are making it a successful podcast. So where is the brand going to not get intimidated and know that they could start somewhere? How does somebody going to start at a podcast level that they are comfortable with and try to grow into what it's meant to be for them? And maybe it's not going to be, I don't know how many viewers he has on the Revisionist History, but I'm assuming it's a lot. So where does somebody get started at? How do you figure out if that's the right move for you?
Yeah, I mean, Revisionist History is a great example to use for a discussion like this, and it's also an awful example to use for a discussion like this, because most people aren't going to be creating narrative podcasts, number one. Most people don't have his innate talent to tell stories, and most people who are going to be listening to this are not trying to create a podcast to get big money or to get big audience numbers to drive advertising revenue. That is one type of podcast, but it's a very, very small kind of part of the overall podcasting ecosystem and why a business should start a podcast. Number one, I think people used to be intimidated by, how do I get good audio quality? That is not a difficult thing. If you're willing to invest a couple of $100, get a good microphone, go through a few steps to get a basic setup for recording, you can get the minimum quality audio that you need, so that when people choose to listen, they don't just immediately flip it off and say, I can't listen to this is terrible. Okay, you don't need to invest thousands of dollars in a professional studio yet. Maybe when you get down the road and you realize you're really serious about it, you can do that. Okay, so the equipment part of it, getting the good audio, should not be intimidating. And then I think from there, you have to keep realistic expectations for the kind of audience that you'll build right off the bat, for how big of an audience that you can grow. And as long as you keep those expectations realistic, you're going to be okay. And also, as long as you have a little bit of compassion for yourself, for the fact that your first few episodes may not be great. And that is okay, especially if you don't have experience doing this, right? Like it may take you a little while to get comfortable doing an interview or to get comfortable behind the microphone to the place where you can actually be yourself instead of, you're podcasting and, maybe you don't sound that comfortable and that kind of thing. And then you eventually get to the point where you're a little bit more comfortable. So don't expect perfection right out of the gate, and don't expect that you need perfection right out of the gate, because the downside when you launch a podcast is probably not that many people are going to listen right off the bat. That's also a positive because it gives you a chance to kind of work out some of those kinks. Like we always tell people on the Showrunner, everybody's got 15, 30, 45 just bad episodes in them. You just got to move past that. But if you genuinely know what audience you're trying to connect with, and if you bring something to them that's valuable, if you at least have that part mostly right from the beginning, you can create something that's valuable and then continue to get better and get better. And so I think just being realistic with those things from the beginning is important.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. We talk a lot here at Rogue about perfection is the enemy of progress. And so often a lot of people are so intimidated by just getting started and maybe not being the best at it. But I mean, you're going to learn so much by just giving it a try, and maybe you're going to find that it's not going to be sustainable for you, but at least you gave it a try. And more than likely than not, you're going to learn a lot and you're going to improve. And next thing you know, you're going to have a good process down and have some good episodes under your belt. So that being said, I think that you touched on a point that is super important. And we talked a little bit about it earlier. And how do you actually integrate a podcast into your marketing strategy? And I think the way that you do that successfully is by understanding what you're trying to achieve with it as the end goal to what your audience needs. And so as a lot of the brands that you work with, what do you find that most often that they are trying to achieve with their audience through a podcast?
Well, I think sometimes people, they think about the podcast and they kind of have the podcast over here on the side. And it's like, I want to launch a podcast and build an audience, right? I want people to listen to my podcast. And some people may even think, and then, I want to get sponsors on the podcast and make money from it. And that's fine. But it's very important to realize that if you don't have 10 to 15,000 downloads per episode, your ability to get a sponsor for that show is going to be very, very limited. And so what we tell people, and I think what is the smartest way to approach this, is it's got to start from your business goals. So your podcast isn't just something separate over here that you're doing. It is an integrated part of your entire marketing strategy. So, and all of your marketing strategy has to be serving the same master, which is the ultimate goals of the business. So then you want to, so once you have those goals in mind and you're clear about them and you understand, what the rest of your marketing mix is and the other things that you're doing, how can the podcast best fit into that? Okay. So, maybe you use a podcast to, maybe you have a product and your product solves a specific problem. And so you're doing a podcast that has people that, tell stories about, about this problem and articulates and agitates the problem a little bit. And then, your podcast is there to remind people that, hey, we have the solution to this, right? Maybe you have a smaller business and you're just kind of getting off the ground. And you really need to start talking to decision makers at bigger companies. Well, we've seen some people use a podcast as a networking tool. So, if you were just to call up and try and get like a 30-minute sales call, you might get the cold shoulder, right? But if you say, hey, I have a podcast, where I'm interviewing successful CEOs on the tactics that help them, how they start their day, the tactics for a successful day. Can I speak with your CEO? Now you might be much more likely to get that conversation, and boom, that door is opened. You've established that relationship. So we've seen people use a podcast for that reason. If you have services or, you sell courses or whatever it is, now your podcast can be a way to give people a taste of that, to kind of open yourself up, let people get to know you a little bit so they can decide, okay, that's pretty smart what they have to say. Let me hire them for their services, or let me, buy their book or whatever it is. So it's got to start from what your business goals are and then figure out, okay, what is the best way with the different formats and the different types of podcasts that I can use? What is the best way for this to help serve those business goals? And people who approach it from that standpoint end up being much more successful than people who think about it as something separate that needs to be monetized separately. No, I think, you should always, or not always, but the vast majority of the time, people should think about how their podcast is going to be monetized indirectly rather than directly. So how it helps you, bring people into your funnel, how it helps you, do different things rather than just,
Right.
hey, we got some advertising on the podcast.
Yeah. I think that's great advice. And just before the show started, we talked a little bit about syndication because we were talking about this show and how we had recently decided, because of podcast and the ability to listen into some audio and it kind of captures your attention a little bit different way. We're going to experiment with adding some of our audio of these shows into a SoundCloud account and just giving the opportunity for our listeners to digest this content in a little bit different format. So I think that is something to keep in mind as well. To your same point is, you're maybe not going to get some huge sponsor, like ZipRecruiter, like Malcolm Gladwell has. I remember it because I listened to so many episodes, so it works. But you're maybe not going to get those huge advertisers, and that's not necessarily going to be your end goal for your podcast. But I think that your podcast and the ability to syndicate out that audio or syndicate out that content on different formats and in different ways, like your idea for using as a networking tool is genius. And I think it's a really great way to turn that cold call into a warm call in one fell swoop. So I can see how that would be really, really valuable for clients. So I think the next thing that people are always kind of curious about, especially when it comes to doing these kind of episodic packaged content pieces, is how do I get started? How do I create a content calendar that is going to align with my business goals, whatever they might be, and B, how do I even go about managing that? Do you have any advice for those things?
Yeah, good question. I think this process always has to start with the audience. So you don't want to get, too far ahead. And this, is the same is true for, a blog strategy, anything. And again, we see people skip over this a little bit too much is, who are you really serving with this podcast? You've got to understand that. Who is this going to be going out to? And then you really want to think about, okay, now how are we going to position this? Because one thing about podcasts, just like with blogs, there are so many blogs out there about every possible topic. And we are not to that level of saturation yet with podcasts, but there are 550,000 shows in Apple Podcasts, which is a lot of shows and like 18 million episodes or something. So which is a little bit scary when you think about it. And it's like, well, why would I even start a show then? But the flip side of that is that I think still only like 30% of people have even listened to a podcast in the United States. So there's still a lot of people who haven't even listened yet. And all of these new shows are bringing new people in. So it does represent a threat that there are so many shows out there, but it's also an opportunity because there are more people now listening. And so that's why
platforms that are hosting it, like Spotify now has the little podcast icon that you can listen to your podcast there. And there's becoming more and more areas that you can locate podcasts. Because I remember talking about podcasts like a year ago to somebody talking about Serial, another big one, and they didn't even know where to get a podcast or to listen to one at. So I think that the learning curve is starting to level out now.
Yeah. And so what that means is that you really have to think about the positioning of your podcast, right? Mm-hmm. Like how, who are we trying to serve with this, and how can we give them something that's a little bit different than maybe what they're getting elsewhere? Because there's so many choices. Why would they choose ours? And so I think once you really understand that can then help you figure out what your format is going to be. Are you going to do half-hour interviews with executives at your company? Are you going to do little 5 to 10 minute, short bits of advice? Are you going to do long monologue episodes? Like, there's no right or wrong answer to that. A lot of it is based on, again, who the audience that you're serving is going to be, how you're trying to position your podcast, and then the people who are going to be behind the microphone, what makes them more comfortable. So a lot of podcasts, you'll see maybe the founders or the owners of a company, and then they'll have someone from the company that interviews them. That can, and it's stuff that, the founder of the company can probably get behind the microphone and talk about this stuff, in their sleep. It's really easy, but just to give them prompts, give them questions, kind of keep it, on topic so that, that episode is about a specific topic. So you want to make those decisions and kind of figure that out and then get on a regular rhythm. That is something that is really easy to take for granted, but is so important. And in fact, we have 4 pillars of a remarkable podcast at the Showrunner. It's authenticity, usefulness, profitability, all of which probably seem pretty obvious, but then sustainability is the other one. It's like for you guys, I mean, this is the 30th episode of this show. That's really, really good, because while there are 550,000 podcasts out there, so many of those fell apart after 5 or 6 episodes or 10 episodes. And you've barely even opened up the feedback loop to know if your content is connecting with an audience and to get some feedback on what you could do better and to really get rolling with it.
Right.
And so, when it comes to managing it on an ongoing basis, once you make that decision for what your initial format is going to be, full well knowing that you can change it later if you need to. So it's not like you're marrying this format forever. Then you want to get on a regular rhythm. And the kind of the rule of thumb is once a week. If you can get an episode out once a week, I think that is ideal. Okay. If it needs to be a little, once a month is better than nothing, but once a week is better than once a month, right? So
you have a specific length in mind?
It's going to depend on the format. So maybe you're going to do like little 5-minute bits. There's a show called 5-Minute Marketing, which is a really smart name for a show. Well, that show is going to be 5 minutes. If you're going to do an interview, you can't really get a good interview done in 10 minutes because you don't have enough time to get into something. That should probably be 25 to 30 minutes. So the length is going to be determined by the format, by the content, that kind of thing. So
I'm really kind of rethinking the name of the show. It should have been 5-minute interviews with awesome people or something like that.
And I say you can't do a fun interview, but that's the thing, is you could maybe position your show as little 5-minute interviews, and that might be a little bit different for people. So there could be an opportunity there. But I think, when you talk about, planning it out on an ongoing basis, you really want to try and think, what can we do and stick to? Because, going back to what we talked about at the beginning with creating a connection from a podcast, it's not just about the time when your voice is in their ear that you create a connection. It's also about when someone starts listening to your show and they know that it comes out on Tuesday afternoon and they get used to it being in their normal rotation and they look for it on Tuesday afternoon, there's an expectation. Now, if your show pops up and you fulfill that expectation and they listen to it, now a little bit of trust is built. But if you're not there, a little bit of trust erodes. And so in anything, you never want to overpromise and underdeliver. So don't say, hey, we're going to be here every week if you're not going to be. So figure out what you can do, what kind of commitments, what kind of promises you can sustain, and then you kind of go from there. And I think as you move forward and that feedback loop is opened and you learn what's working and you learn what's not, I think it can be a really smart thing to do, to look at other content that you've already had that's been successful, successful blog posts or, parts of a presentation, that someone gives in your company that really seems to hit really well. And how can we then work that into the podcast content? Because a podcast episode doesn't need to be completely different from any blog post that you've ever done. In fact, your most successful blog post, you should find a way to make those podcasts, whether it's straight reading it, whether it's just, interviewing someone and getting those points out there, because you're probably going to reach a different audience with the podcast than with the blog post. And if you don't, someone who read the blog post, it might have been 3 months ago, and now you can hit them with that content again. Yeah. So it's kind of a way to repurpose content across the different mediums and leverage and just be more efficient with it.
Yeah. And again, I think people digest content in different ways and internalize it in different ways in the different formats that they hear it too. So the blog post, more likely than not, might have been skimmed a little bit and read a while ago. So if you do it in a podcast format and you engage the viewer a little bit more, it might actually resonate with them just a little bit deeper. And next thing you know, they are welcoming your cold call and wanting to talk to you about it. So I heard you say, figure out what the format of your content based upon the goals of your customer base and what you're trying to achieve there. And then figure out a content calendar from there. So that way you can maintain some consistency. And then keep in mind that you need to have some scalability and make sure that whatever it is that you're doing, you're able to maintain, and just know that not everything is going to be a Malcolm Gladwell episode of the revisionist history, but there's proof and there's trust being built in that consistent nature of what you're doing. So I think it's all really great advice. So we'll kind of wrap things up for today. Is there anything else that you would like to share with our viewers before we hop off here? Any last thoughts?
I think the last thing would be, to kind of take it one step further from what you just talked about with the content calendar, is understanding the importance of systems and templates. And they can really be helpful for podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to get behind the microphone and everything be different from one episode to another. People tend to like some sort of familiarity. Like I always think with the shows that I produce, like I want listening to our show to be like putting on your most comfortable t-shirt, and it's like you know how it feels, it's comfortable. And so I think, having consistent intros, having a consistent way that you present the information, within that, then you talk about different topics, but that can really help you prepare because you know what little blanks you need to fill in for this episode. And same thing with editing. When you have your templates, when you have those things, it may take you 10 to 15 episodes to get into that rhythm, but you can really cut down on the time each episode takes when you're smart about systems and templates. And so, don't think that you have to kind of recreate everything with every episode. I actually think you can do more harm than good and lose some of the connection when you try and do that. So that's something that helps create connection, helps save time too, and is really smart to think about.
I think that's great advice. And I know I was giving you a last thought, but really quickly before we get off, I have the question, so I'm assuming some of our viewers might also have the question, but is there any editing software out there that you would recommend for maybe the beginners to intermediate level of somebody who's wanting to maybe do some podcasting or test some things out on their own? Is there anything that you would recommend that they could play around with?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you need to get more sophisticated than GarageBand, which comes free with Macs, and then Audacity is the one that you would use if it's a PC, and those are simple, but they get the job done. I mean, because all you really need when you're starting out is the ability to put some bumper music in there, and then just line up your your interviews or your voice tracks, and you can do that fine there. Now, you want to get really serious, you can use Adobe Audition and some of those other ones, but I would allow yourself to graduate into that. And so I think there's no reason to invest in really expensive software. Just go with that stuff, get a feel for it, and then you can move on to something else if you need it.
Get in your groove. And
I still use GarageBand for my shows, and I tried Audition and it didn't work that well on my computer, and I was like, I don't even really need it. Like I ordered some plugins and that kind of thing, but GarageBand does what I need it to do, so no reason to overcomplicate it.
I like it. I love that advice. I definitely am always on the side of the simpler, the better, and it really always comes across to your viewers better too that way. Well, thank you, Jerod, so much for coming on. Today's episode was really interesting to me, and I hope that our viewers enjoy it too. I know that they will. As usual, we will be posting this episode over on our blog with a few additional resources that we discussed today. Jerod has some good ideas, and he's going to send those my way. So I'll link those up for y'all, and we will see you guys next week to talk about some of the Facebook algorithm changes, and we hope you have a good rest of your day. See you later.
Bye, everybody.